And we're here to talk about automating business processes with InfoPath, business connectivity services, make sure I'm not missing anything here, workflows, and Microsoft Word services, also known as Word automation services as well. Just to give a little history back on a little bit about me, I've been with Microsoft for 5 years. Prior to that, I was basically sitting where you guys are. Been in IT for probably well over 12 years. I've written a book, a couple magazine articles, and prior to taking on this role within the product group, I was a consultant. So I've lived and breathed many of the pains and angst that many of you go through. Now with that, I'd like to know by a show of hands, how many of you would consider yourself a pro developer? Raise your hand. Okay. How many would you consider yourself an IT pro admin? Raise your hand. Okay. How many would you consider neither of those? That is outstanding. Because when we talk about automating the business process, one of the things we're going to talk about is composite applications. And the composite applications, we're actually focusing more on the power user in the IW than necessarily a pro developer or IT pro type of individual. So some of the session objectives is two key things I want to make sure that you get out of this is to be able to identify the various components that can be used to create composite applications on SharePoint. Now, these are not comprehensive of every single component possible, but we're going to focus specifically on a scenario. But to kind of give you an idea, a lot of sessions you'll go to, you'll learn how to use InfoPath, how to use workflow, or you learn BCS, or maybe you might learn one or two. But how can you really combine all these components together to create one overall solution? And also, we'll go over a little bit about the best practices for each one of the different type of components used. And so you can get an idea of like some tidbits and some pieces of information, what to do, what not to do. The agenda will be as follows. We'll talk a little bit about SharePoint composite applications. We'll go into actually building the solution. We'll describe the problem. And then we'll go into each of the 4 core technologies that were used to solve the problem. So what are SharePoint composite applications? Well, they're typically built on SharePoint, first of all. Typically, a composite application, just like anything else, so many of you pro developers, if you think like Silverlight or WPF, have looked at things from patterns and practices. The concept of composite application is kind of the same thing, where you're taking multiple components together that can live on their own, like InfoPath or workflow, and actually be part of an overall solution. They will typically consist of the core components that any application would. So you'll have data access. You'll have your domain logic or business logic, and you'll have some type of user interface. Typically, most of these types of applications are built declaratively. There's not a whole lot of programming in there. Now, in the realistic, real environment, that's not true. So when we think about the things that are composite applications, where we talk about no-code solutions, we talk about that IW individual who's actually declaratively wiring up or defining or configuring the solution. But the fact is, they're wiring up components. Now, whether it came out of the box with SharePoint, it could have been built by a third party, maybe bought some web parts from a partner or a vendor, or maybe you had something developed in-house. Maybe it's wiring up BCS to an Oracle database that's in-house. There's components that require the IT department and your pro developers to actually help build these architectural type components that can be used by the IW. So some overall best practices with composite applications. You want to try to configure and define before you go ahead and code. It enables the end user to solve business problems in a reusable way. It helps IT to focus on core functions, such as building architectural components, building reusable components for their environments to reuse. So that way, you're not building the whole solution. You're building parts of the solution. Maybe initially you're building 50%, 60% of the solution, but as you start building these reusable components, hopefully that'll become less and less and less. And that way you guys can focus on other things than trying to meet all the needs of a particular organization. Typically, your business units have this huge stack, maybe 100, 200 different projects that they want worked on. Unfortunately, in today's world, IT resources are not unlimited. We all wish they were. So by being able to do this, by being able to focus on those core components, the IT departments can go ahead and get done what needs to get done for those 200 projects, and the IWs and power users can go ahead and do the other types of tasks, such as creating a SharePoint list, defining an InfoPath form, wiring up a SharePoint workflow. Try to utilize ALM methodologies, ideally without the user knowing. And when I say the user, I talk about the power user. These are still applications. You don't want them testing in production. And it's not so much about creating the application that can be of a concern, it's about maintaining it. What happens when I already have a workflow out there and I need to start making changes? What is the impact of that going to be? Now, there are some deep-level tricks, which if you pay attention to my blog, that I've kind of gone over in the past, and I'll be doing other tricks going forward about how you can deploy SharePoint workflows between multiple farms. So if you have a development farm and your production farm, there are ways to move things across without necessarily having to pull in the, have to reconfigure the workflow in production. SharePoint Designer is doing it, so obviously it's not impossible to do. And believe it or not, all the APIs to do that are all public. It's not like we're talking about going into any hidden members. It's just not documented. Typically use the sandbox and client-side object model as much as possible, and try to target Office 365 as much as possible, even when you're building on-prem. The fact is, Office 365 is going to have to be able to live between multiple, iterations as we, keep improving on features. We're not going to want to break what's already there. And that's one of the key value propositions of Office 365. So if you design it with Office 365 in mind, chances are when you come up to the next version of SharePoint, your changes are going to be very minimal, if any, if you built it for taking Office 365 into mind. So there's the key tip there. So let's talk about the business problem. Typically, every organization has this. You need to interview and hire new employees. Employees leave, companies expand. There's always a certain amount of attrition that's occurring. The business process for a typical environment for hiring creating new hires would be to create a new job requisition. So you have to go ahead and create it. Approve the job requisition. Just because you say you want the head count doesn't mean you can get the head count. You want to be able to apply someone needs to be able to apply for the job. You need to interview the candidate, offer the job, make sure everything is kosher with the offer itself, and then finally onboard the new hire. And for Contoso, the process is pretty chaotic. It's mostly managed by email. Sometimes it's managed using inter-office mail, paperwork flying around. There's no good way to have any accountability for how the process is actually working. Always copy and paste errors and other type of errors are prone, like for instance when the domain admin accidentally fat fingers the person's first name or last name or their actual account code, their user ID, which happens sometimes. So the process from a visual standpoint is you add new job postings, candidate applies, then you go to interview the candidate, offer the candidate a position, and then onboard the new hire. So the development responsibilities are going to be broken into two different types of developers. First, over on the left-hand side, we have the IW power user. They're going to be responsible for creating the lists, the InfoPath forms, the workflows, external lists, and those types of components that are relatively easy to build. The pro developer is going to do some other things. They're going to actually be able to create an Active Directory web service. This web service is actually going to be used by the external list to be able to create the Active Directory account itself for that particular new hire. They'll be able to, the pro developer is going to create the ability to create an offer letter using word automation services. We're going to go ahead and create a document conversion activity that's going to take that Word document, turn it into a PDF so it's a little more finalized and more readily readable by different individuals. And finally, we're going to create an extended copy list item activity. One of the key components of this application is that there's actually two separate farms. There is the internet farm and the intranet farm. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to copy data between those two farms. So the job requisitions will be created on the intranet farm. Then we're going to use on the internet farm where www.contelsa.com is, we're actually going to use dataform web parts and XML to actually pull that information from the intranet site, theoretically across the firewall, but it's all on one demo machine here. And then once an applicant applies for a job, that data in their application profile is going to be copied through this specialized copy list item workflow activity to the intranet farm itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at the completed solution first. This is a typical intranet site. We'll go ahead and go into the recruitment site itself. And as you can see, I have multiple job requisitions that I've created. Now, I will fully admit, this demo does have different roles in SharePoint groups. I made the SharePoint admin part of each one of these groups, so I don't have to log in and log out, because there's basically 12 different profiles of roles, and we get into like as deep as like phone acquisition roles, desktop hardware acquisition roles, and those sort of things. So just to make it easy so I'm not logging in and logging out over and over, the SharePoint admin is actually a part of all these different groups. So as you can see, I went ahead and I approved the business administration, this one software development and engineer's profile. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take a look at what that looks like over on the Contelsa site. So some of you may have seen this electronics demo. We've added a new component to it called Careers. As that quickly spins up, hopefully relatively quickly. So within here, we're going to be able to, I've included fast search, so you can actually be able to search on the various job openings. Now, obviously, I have two, so I don't really need to include that, but you can go ahead and make that part of the overall application. And then right here, what I have is right now I'm logged in as the system account. So what I'll do is I'll actually going to back out of this real quick. It's trying to still log me in as a system account, which is not good. And we're not gonna hang on a quick second. Well, I do have another profile on here with forms authentication that would actually allow me to log in. So there would be a section underneath here that would define the jobs that I've applied for. I should actually be able just to go in and apply for myself right here. So if I click apply, assuming this doesn't blow up on me. It'll go ahead and send the software development engineer profile for me to apply for it. So I've successfully applied for the position. So now that I've successfully applied for the position itself, we can go ahead and take a look at the job applicants as the hiring manager that are available to me. So I can go to the job applications list, and here I can see that I have the business administrators being as the individual that is available to as myself. So please don't tell Microsoft I'm trying to be hired by Contelsa. I can go ahead and view the details of this particular user. And just to save time, I've actually already assigned an interviewer who is David Simpson. And we'll go ahead and we'll start the interview process workflow. While that occurs, we'll go ahead and open up SharePoint Designer and take a look at the workflow itself to kind of get an idea of what's happening within the workflow. So now that this workflow is opening and we're just, looks like it already opened up. Very good. Okay, so within here, if the applicant didn't create a user profile, what will occur is that a profile will be the name and last name will assume the identity of the login account of the applicant's name. In this case, in that type of case, the business admin or the hiring manager admin would have to go ahead and fill in those fields by hand. Otherwise, what it's going to do is it's going to wait for an interviewers to be specified, and once the interviewer is specified, it'll start the feedback loop with those interviewers. Finally, it'll come down to the hiring manager itself to make a final approval. The hiring manager will go yes or no. Then we'll set the status to selected, which is basically saying that we're offering the individual job. We'll create an item in the hired candidates list, and from there, we'll go to 2 custom activities, which don't come out of the box. One is going to create a resume, and I'll show you the details on how that works in a little while. And the other one is going to say convert the current document to the resume file URL. So we'll go back to the job applicants list here. And we'll go through and say, Keenan is a rock star. And now went ahead and that part of the workflow has completed. Now it's going to go to the hiring manager. And again, because I'm just doing this as administrator to save time as to log in and log out, this person's a hire. So we'll just go ahead and hire this individual. Now what's going to happen is it's going to insert that particular list item into the hired candidates list. It's also going to utilize a special custom activity that I wrote that's going to create the offer letter for me. It's going to take the first name, last name, and plug that information in. You could also include things like whatever you want as part of the job, say the salary, benefits, and whatever it may be. And then finally, it's going to kick off a job. Now, it says it's not started here, but in reality, what's probably happened is that it's actually just been queued up by the timer job, and it'll get kicked off in a few moments. So we can just go ahead and go back and take a look at the workflow and see if it's finalized. Now you will see the errors in here, all related to the email messages. It's just because I just don't have Exchange up and running currently, but that's to be completely expected. And we're just going to wait for this to occur. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and come back to this portion once the timer job decides to go ahead and complete the workflow, because it got serialized and queued up, and we'll kick off in a few minutes. So with that, we'll go ahead and flip back over to the PowerPoint deck and continue on, and then we're going to go and jump into Business Connectivity Services. So Business Connectivity Services offers a whole lot of greatness. I can basically tie into any line of business application. With SharePoint Designer, I can very easily hook up into SQL Server or any WCF service. Now, my number one recommendation is never hook up BCS directly into SQL Server. Why? It's because typically you want some type of control, some type of logic, especially when you're updating, deleting, and creating new items. And you have some type of domain logic within your organizations. Typically, the best solution to solve this is to actually create a WCF service. Now, I know with SharePoint Designer you can create external content types. And with those external content types, typically IWs don't make the greatest data connections. So it's one of those things that, and one of the things that we offered in SharePoint 2010 was the ability for the central admin to go ahead and say, hey, is this particular external content type going to be allowed to access this data, yes or no? So it can be a final check from within the IT organization to make sure, to validate that the connection is, for lack of better words, a good practice or not. So some of the things you can do with business connectivity services is, of course, obviously create external lists. I can go ahead and bring data with InfoPath forms into Workspace. I can go ahead and make them part of search results. So I can create a profile page. I can go ahead and index on the data and be able to create a customized page for that particular data type. For instance, maybe I might have an SAP or Dynamics CRM, and I'm creating an external content type. Maybe I'll create a profile page that maybe shows the picture of the contact or some more other credible, some that's more formatted to that type of entity. I can also involve it with Office applications and bringing data into Office applications, like to create tables and repeating lists. And one cool thing that I really like to do is with Outlook, you can specify various types of connections as either a Outlook contact, an Outlook appointment, or a task, and or a note itself. And you can actually bring that into Outlook, and it'll be treated just like an Outlook contact. The one key thing to remember is that the synchronization is manual. It will not automatically synchronize back and forth. But it's a great way to be able to bring the data in and take it offline and go to some other, when you're working on a plane, and go ahead and edit that information. And once you're connected back to the network, go ahead and update those changes. So talk a little bit about the external content type. It's a superset of capabilities. Basically, it defines the fields, the methods, create, update, read, delete, and the connections themselves. Defines the behavior, how it's going to interact with SharePoint and Office. It's managed and reused from a central location. So you, for the entire site collection itself, you have your different external content types, and then from central admin, you can basically define who has permissions to actually leverage those content types. You can add it through business data connectivity services through SharePoint Designer. You can write them, customize them with Visual Studio 2010, or you can import a business data connectivity model. Now, one thing that's really common, people that ask me all the time is, what happened to BDC? Well, BDC is still there, but it's underneath the entire umbrella of business connectivity services as a whole. So it hasn't gone away. So one of the key things a lot of people ask about is about authentication and connectivity. And basically there's, out of the box, there's support for 3 different types. You have a Windows authentication, forms-based authentication, and claims-based authentication. You have different types of modes for how the authentication works. So there's revert to self, pass-through, and the secure store service. Generally, the last one, secure store service, is probably the best way to go. It's best involved for connection handling. Now, I know many organizations will say, well, yeah, but I need to know who's actually connecting to my database. So I really want to pass through who it is. In reality, you don't really want to know who's connecting to your database. What you really want to do is you want to be able to log and track who performed a specific function. And that function may be connecting to that database. So this is where, again, where those web services come into play, and where you can actually use the logging features within SharePoint to actually see who's doing what. So some best practices. Never, ever use revert to self. That basically is going to use the identity of SharePoint to attempt to, or the identity of the workflow that's running to actually execute that particular call to that database. Use pass-through or SSO. Secure sign-on is probably my more favorite, but if you have to, you can use pass-through, no problem. Stay away from external list lookup columns. At least understand the implications with doing so. So while it is a feature and it can be very handy, it also can be a very dangerous feature. If the external list is something that only certain people are allowed to see, what SharePoint will do is it'll actually cache that list in that external lookup column. So when someone else that is not supposed to be able to see all the items in that list goes and views that list that's part of that lookup column, they will see everything they're not supposed to see because it's cached. And it's cached as the user who's actually making that making the initial list itself. As I mentioned before, end users typically don't make good data connections. It's one of those things, they've obviously been doing it forever with ODBC, and probably a lot of you went through a lot of pain because of that, because they've been connecting things, and all of a sudden you notice performance problems in various applications or in your databases. But it's a good thing in SharePoint 2010 that at least there's ability to review it. And the good thing is if you change the external content type, those permissions are blown away and they have to be recreated. So it's a pretty good safety gap. One thing that we always talk about is that you can't initiate a workflow from a external list. Well, that's not true, exactly. So if you think about it, with a regular SharePoint list, the data store is the SharePoint list. So we know when a change is going to occur. So when a change occurs in that SharePoint list, we know to kick off a workflow. But if I have an external SQL database that I'm connecting to, if some other application's making changes on that database, well, I don't know when to kick off the workflow because SharePoint doesn't know what those changes are. Hence, what the last two bullet items there is, have the external data store call the workflow. There is a web service in your VTI bin. You can go ahead and pull the WSDL down, and you can initiate any workflow within your environment. So you could use like SQL notification services, or some code, or off a trigger, whatever it may be. Call the workflow ASMX file and initiate your workflow that way. So there are ways to do it. Yes, it is some custom code, but it is possible to be done. So we'll take a look at what we did with BCS to actually be able to add and view. We'll open up SharePoint Designer, and we'll take a look at the external content types. Now what I did is I created a web service, and this WCF service I can connect to pretty much just like a regular SQL connection. So the external service is simply say HR Web Service. I basically just define where it's located. So I just created a web application, stuck it on my demo machine here. And because of the nature of it, I will omit that I am, for this external content type, I am using revert to self. Excuse me. Yeah, so that's one thing to just take note. But again, this is a demo, so I'm allowed. And basically, I have three different types of commands here. So I have a create new hire, get new hire, and get new hires. Now I notice I don't have an update and delete, and there's no rule saying you have to have an update and delete available. Just type in my... We'll have to take a look at that a little bit later because the WCF service is probably still spinning up. So basically, I have three different commands. I've created the create a new hire. You have to also to return lists. I have to also have a get list to get an item of a complete list of all items, and then for each and every single item, I have to have a get. So if we actually take a look at the let's go ahead and close that. content type itself. Maybe the demo gods be good to me. There we go. So this information is actually coming from Active Directory itself. So here, don't tell my wife I used her name. Kimberly here is a person that's part of my Contelsa new hires. So if I go in, we can actually just take a quick gander at the users in here. And if I scroll down, I will see there's Kimberly right there. And what I did is, as a filter, because you generally want to filter your data somehow, is I went ahead and made her part of the Contelsa new hire. So when a new hire comes in, I just don't necessarily give her full permissions to everything or to whatever she needs. I put her in a special group that I know I can go back into, and it's kind of like a safe repository. If you also notice that there was a name in here called Dan J, who is the manager for Kim. So if we actually take a look at the account itself, the manager, we can see that Dan Jump is the manager, so it did properly assign that to her. And then if we take a look at the username, we can see that the user ID of Ross Kim is equal to the Ross Kim which we see in Active Directory. So we know everything is properly working there. So real quick, we're going to switch back, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at that job applicant, and I think we should be just about done. And yeah, it looks like it went ahead and completed that process. So if we take a look, the SharePoint timer job went ahead and picked up that workflow again and completed the process for the hiring manager, for myself. So it looks like I got a job. And I also put in some comments in here with my code. Is I created a resume and went ahead and saved that resume. An offer. Saved off that offer, and then I created a document conversion ID to take that offer letter and turn it over into a PDF file. So we can just go ahead and look at what that looks like. I just went ahead and made the libraries readily available. There's the offer letter. Let's go ahead and open up in Word. And there you can see properly put my name in there. And I just wanted to simplify this without all the other hocus pocus of what a job offer will look like. And there's my name again. So here I'm using Word automation services, and we'll go in when we get to that section, and I'll show you the code for doing it. It's a really cool tool for taking a Word document and turning it all into code. So that way you can just say, here, give me to a user, here, give me that offer letter, give me that Word document, and just in a few clicks, you've got a completely C# class file that actually will generate that whole Word document, and you can modify that document and make those changes. I'll show you exactly how I did that. So we can see that was done. Now let's take a look to see if our PDF file has been created. Looks like it was. Now, if you remember from the prior file, you'll see that there's about a 10-minute lapse in between the two. And just because, again, it's a timer job that picks up the Word automation service job. So just because you say, hey, I want to go ahead and create a PDF file, doesn't mean you're going to get it right away. Now, I left the default setting of 15 minutes. You can set it down to less than 1 minute, but you can't really force the job to kick off without doing unorthodox things. So we can see that we have a new hired candidate, which is me, which is great. We'll go ahead and go into this workflow because now we need to provision the services for myself. I need a laptop, phone, an office, and all that good stuff. So I can see I have this workflow set up so I can go ahead and change any of the groups that I have, but we'll just leave it as such. I don't have to put in a first name or last name because it's going to pull that information for me automatically. While this process is, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and switch over to the, back to the deck, and then we'll come back to this once we go over the InfoPath component. Okay, so let's talk about InfoPath. So InfoPath is great for building rich formatting experiences. Put in images, lay things out differently. It's a really great tool. It's a very powerful tool. You can include C# and other types of code within inside of it. You can create rules declaratively, so you don't have to be a developer. You can actually assign and define rules. You can perform data validation. So you can say, hey, does this actually look like a phone number, or is it a postal code, or is it not? And I can also pull data in from various data sources as well. SharePoint, external lists, a SQL database, OLADB, whatever it may be, ODBC, you name it, you can pretty much pull it in. Another great thing is the InfoPath web part. So this web part allows you to take, as opposed to showing an entire page, you can actually make your InfoPath document a particular section of the page and be able to interact with it. Now, some of you may be familiar with something called Xforms, and InfoPath is not Xforms. Xforms requires a plugin that's within the browser. So that means whatever browser you may have with the Xforms technology has to have this plugin to make it work. With InfoPath, what it does differently is, as opposed to trying to generate the form in the browser using that add-in, it actually generates it on the server using XSLT, and then generates the final output as HTML. So it's kind of Xforms-like, but it's not, and that's the key differentiating difference. So the type of components you can integrate, obviously, with workflow, you can do like reporting type of tasks with InfoPath, just create like a table report. You could also use SQL Server reporting services for that type of task as well. You can define custom pages as a whole InfoPath page. Like, for instance, for a list, as opposed to using the regular list form pages, you can actually just swap that out with an InfoPath page itself and just use that InfoPath page to make the changes. And you can add all the goodness that InfoPath gives you with the rule validations. You can plug that in. You can design custom workflow initiation and task forms. So as you saw with the when I kicked off the new hire preparation workflow, you saw that form where it asked those names. Well, that's all InfoPath. So all that, all those features are there, and I could actually customize those forms and put in specific specific rules for those forms. I can integrate with business connectivity services to create, read, update, and delete, and of course we have the InfoPath web part. So some best practices. Handle lookup data trimming. So remember we talked about external lists and having that lookup column. Well, that doesn't mean you can't have a lookup column that can't be serviced via InfoPath. So if I need to go ahead and pull external data, as opposed to having to use the external list data lookup column, I can just create like a regular column, and then for the form designer itself, I'll define an InfoPath form that I'll bind a secondary data connection to pull that list of data down. So that way I can make sure that the identity of who's pulling that data down is not pulling anything other than what their identity is allowed to pull down, what they're authorized to pull down. Use it to populate and fill data automatically as much as possible. You have the I put asterisk event rules because on load, on click, on submit. So you can actually apply different rules based on what occurs, and it's an easy way for end users to create to lay out InfoPath forms. Now, I'll admit, from my experiences, not a whole lot of IWs actually go through the whole gamut of creating InfoPath forms. They kind of will lay things out, maybe do some basic things, but typically it takes an IT pro or developer to complete things off. And when we talk about the developer IT pro being involved, this is a great way to define the user requirement of what they're looking for, and then just that developer pro maybe to make those last bit connections for them. Sometimes you will find a power user that can do so, but a lot of times, I'll admit, most organizations, at least what I've seen, don't document things well. And unless you define where all your web services are, IW is not going to be able to find them relatively easily. So let's go ahead and take a look at that InfoPath form. Just going to close all those windows for right now, save resources as much as possible. So here I have an InfoPath form that I defined. This was when I was trying to log in as my account, what I was going to try to show you. So when you created that, your login and user ID with the forms-based authentication, you then have the ability to create your own profile. And with this profile, you can define who you are, where you're located. I have them where you can have the highest degree, and key skills and preferred job locations. Now, if you look at the managed data connections, you'll see I have 2 secondary connections in here. And you can tell by the 4th line there, which I'm sorry I can't expand this, but InfoPath doesn't allow me to change the font size with these forms. But you can actually see that's the secondary data source. Now, the core data source itself is the SharePoint library list itself. But my skill sets, my locations, come from another data source. So by doing that, I can actually be able to populate like list boxes or drop downs from various other data sources pretty easily. So for instance, if I go into the properties itself, I can right in the middle here, I can say specify skill set, and I'll define the data path itself, which I can easily use the tool to do so, and define the values that I want to actually show, and the actual value itself that will get saved into the form that will get submitted. So it's a great way. It's all point and click. I didn't have to write any code to make this happen at all. Let's see. For this particular document, I actually don't have any rules set up, but you can go ahead and set up various rules as necessary. So, 1 second here. So that's pretty much what it takes for the InfoPath form itself. And I also define the education work history, and they can attach a resume to this document as well. So now we'll go back to continue on with our workflow. Hopefully that process has been completely kicked off, and we should be able to see where we're at. So we can see that the new hire prep is in progress. I can see the first task is for my business administrator. First, we're going to define the hiring manager. So we'll go ahead and specify Dan J. Now, granted, this is another InfoPath form that I'm using. I can specify the type of hardware, and when I specify this hardware, that's going to tell the next level of the task who is actually going to what type of hardware that they need for the hardware procurement manager. So once this is done, I can specify an office, and we'll just specify 1234 for the office number, and we'll click submit. So right away, I get 2 new things. I get procurement hardware for new hire. So now the procurement contact is going to get this request to actually set this up. So it's in here, as you can see, it says, please provision a laptop for this new hire. So it took what the business admin said, and when it was able to plug it into my comment here, and we'll click hardware sent. So I'm getting a new laptop, which is fantastic. Hopefully it has a quad core, 16 gigs of memory. I need them for my demos. And then next we'll provision a telephone, because I have to make phone calls. Phone calls are good. And we'll give myself a number here, because I'm actually using a rule saying that this can't be blank. And the phone has been sent. Now, next thing that'll occur is they'll automatically create part of this workflow is it'll create my Active Directory user account. Now, because it's something that can be done asynchronously, it'll just show in progress. So we're just going to go let that cook for a few seconds, and we'll continue on with the presentation. Word automation services. It provides basically the save as functionality that you get in Word. It can support OpenXML, Word 97 through 2003, pretty much all the file formats, I believe RTF as well, and single web page formats where it's kind of a whole web page and all the graphics are put all into a zip file. It also supports the open file automatic tasks. So this will recalculate field types. So if you specified properties in your document and you update those properties, when it opens, you can say, hey, do you want to do update all the fields? You can say yes, and all your properties and fields will be automatically updated. It'll merge various format chunks together. And it also will update your table of contents as well. Key things you can do with here that you can't do with the the Office XML SDK is save as a PDF or output as XPS. When you're using Word automation services, unless you just want to kick out the same document over and over again, you're probably going to be involving OpenXML as a precursor to creating a document or modifying that particular document. One important thing, it can't handle RIM. So if you're using rights information management, you're going to be out of luck. You'll have to remove that. So let's take a look at what we did to make that happen. So as I said before, there's this cool little tool here that will take a Word document as it's loading its components, and it'll take the Word document and actually create an entire class file for me. So I have the Word document right here on the desktop, and you'll see over on the left-hand side, it'll actually it'll actually show me how the structure of the document itself, and I can just click on Reflect Code. Voila. It's an entire class file that'll go ahead and generate the entire document for me. Now, luckily, I've actually already went ahead and generated this document with Visual Studio. So we'll open up that next. To make this easy, you can just basically say copy all file and copy it into your project. And I'll show you where I made my modifications in order to support this recruitment portal. Yes. I'm sorry, the question was Word automation services requires Office web apps to be installed, and that's correct. So within here, I have the resume builder activity, which actually I'll show you the resume builder first. So the resume builder itself, basically this is the class file that I created. I just made some minor changes to it. Out of the box, these two methods did not come with it of inserting the first name and last name, so I included those in. And then I went to the generate main document part, and when it's writing all the document, and as you can see, it's basically just writing code. It basically reflected the entire Word document and turned it into just a bunch of code. You can actually see here, you can see all the different changes and edits that someone actually makes, which is interesting. You can see that here I have my date of when so I can go ahead and insert something else. But down here, where it says Dear, I said here's the text, and I insert that first name and last name. So when it goes ahead and generates this, it's going to insert the first name and last name that's specified in that method. Now that first name and last name is going to come from the workflow activity itself, which is right here. Now this workflow activity basically takes in the properties of the list name that I want to assign the document to. So where am I going to place the name? Actually, I probably should have called it document library name, but I think you get the point. The first name, last name, as well as the resume file URL, which basically is the URL that was created. That's actually going to be an output property, and also the workflow context property itself. So I just take the first name and last name, and I override the activity execution. The execute method that returns an activity execution status, and I basically just called my method here called create resume. Remember seeing those comments where I mentioned resume creation. Right there, I can't spell, but that's okay. And I went through and created the web parts and specified the first name and last name, and that was really it. So one of the things that when it comes to word automation services, now there's other ways to do this. Obviously, I could pull the XML out using the the Office SDK, and go ahead and use like Xlink or whatever it may be, or what type of XML parsing that I decide to do to actually make these modifications. But I just wanted to show you this because this is just another way to actually be able to handle it without having to deal with all that. Because a lot of times, sometimes people are intimidated and just say, hey, I have a template. It's not going to change very often. It just is what it is. In this case, an offer letter. Not going to change the offer letter too much unless the company name changes. So this is something that I can do relatively easily and with a minimal amount of effort because I'm using the tools to do so. Now that tool that I showed you that actually built that class file, that comes with the SDK toolkit. So when you go and download it from downloads.microsoft.com, you'll have that tool that'll be put into your Start Programs menu for you automatically. Really cool tool. So with that, what we'll do is we'll go back. This is not a sandbox solution. Yes. So the question is, how did I deploy these? And I'll admit, now with the creation of the document, that could be partially a sandbox activity. However, the word automation activity will not work because of the way it makes its calls. So it's one thing to keep. You can't make that a sandbox solution. Now the other, because I'm doing things with Active Directory, obviously I can't. Those other code bits, my other activities cannot be sandboxed as well. To answer your question? Yep. So and basically, I create a feature, and I'll show you that whole Visual Studio stack in a little bit later when we get to the workflow itself. So if we go ahead, and we'll just go ahead and refresh this page. Hopefully, we're no longer in progress. We can see that it completed properly. So if all goes well, and the whole hiring process worked, if I look at my Contosa new hires, I should see myself in there within Active Directory. And there I am. So this is a way. Now I know a lot of you IT guys saying there is no way in heck that I'm going to go ahead and allow a custom activity to go ahead and insert something into Active Directory for me. I've heard the comment before, but the fact of the matter is that if you can make yourself part of that approval process as well. So there's nothing stopping you from making you saying that you have to sign off saying yes, add this person to Active Directory. So effectively, you are still giving the okay, even though you're letting the process do it for you. And the real reason why. I think it's beneficial to do so because it's a process that you don't have to do manually. There's no reason why you have to physically go in and type something in by hand or use necessarily a third-party tool for something that you could do relatively easy yourself. Yes, there's a question right there. Honestly, the reason why so the web service is actually using Active Directory web service. So the question is, why did I build the web service as opposed to using like Active Directory web services directly within a custom activity? I could have done that. I wanted to show BCS. That was the real reason why I wanted to do it, because You can, and I really want to show how you can use BCS with something that's not a database. Active Directory is, I guess you could say it's like a data store, but it's not a true relational database. So it's just a kind of a cool sample demo. Typically, if I was going to do this in a real environment, I probably would create a custom activity that would do this for me. Sure, absolutely. So now we went through the whole process there. So we'll go ahead and flip back to our demo. To our PowerPoint. We're going to talk about our last section here, a little bit on workflow. So with Visio, I can actually define, maybe not use define, lay out my workflow. Because the reality fact is you can't really create a workflow in its full entirety within Visio. You basically lay out the shapes, and this is really great for like a business analyst or a business user to go ahead and define what they want. And it's important for you folks to tell them that, hey, not only do they have to create the shapes, because they'll create all the shapes and hand it off to you and say, okay, there you go, but actually put good descriptions inside those little shapes so you know what they're trying to do or what they want done. So for instance, if you want to say, hey, I want to hire a new candidate, say, hey, I want to hire a new candidate and pull it from this SharePoint list. They should be able to tell you that, where that candidate list is sitting. But it's a great way to communicate the business requirements from an IW to a like maybe like a power user or developer if necessary. So there's also been some improvements made within SharePoint Designer, such as a better way being able to move that Visio, import it and export it, and of course being able to publish it and use it within SharePoint. So you can actually create, once you create your workflow in SharePoint Designer, you'll actually be able to see it using Visio Services, if you have that installed. You'll actually be able to see at what stage a particular workflow is running at. Now, there's some caveats. If you think your Visual Studio workflow that you custom built is going to show up there, you're wrong. It's not. Because Visual Services doesn't, that's a compiled assembly, it doesn't understand that. What SharePoint Designer does underneath the hood, I'm going to tell you a little tidbit. Don't mess with it, please, but I will tell you what it's actually doing. It's writing an actual XAML file. And it's creating that XAML file, and it's publishing that into a hidden document library called Workflows. Now, within that document library, SharePoint will actually go through the process of validating it, making sure it's valid, making sure all the components you said were there are going to be there, and go ahead and actually compile an assembly for you on the fly. If you checked use Visio Services, it'll actually make special hooks to create the necessary components within that XAML file to show what it needs to show in Visio Services. That's why it doesn't work with Visual Studio. The kind of just went over this, but just a quick review. Almost all of the activities that are available within, just one thing I wanted to talk about here, almost all the activities within SharePoint Designer are available within Visio. There are a few like string utility functions that are not. And also if you create custom activities and you import it back into Visio, they'll just show up as like a custom square, but you can't actually create the custom square with Visio. So again, it's just a good tool to kind of just to lay things out. One important thing is you can't do this. If I have a workflow in SharePoint Designer, I go ahead and export it into Visio, I make some changes, think I'm going to import it back in again, yeah, it's going to tell you can't do that because you already have that workflow exists. So you can't make that back and forth change. Now once you import something from Visio, you're going to have to go in and configure it. So Visio doesn't understand your SharePoint lists. It doesn't understand your SharePoint infrastructure. So that's why I say it's good for laying out a workflow, but you actually have to go through in SharePoint Designer and actually make all the connections happen. Best practices. I like to call this configure, extend, create. Configure means use out-of-the-box or SharePoint Designer. Use the out-of-the-box workflows. There's a lot of cool workflows that will probably meet 85–90% of your organization's needs, such as approval, a 3-state workflow, collecting feedback, and whatnot. Extend, create custom activities. Don't jump to Visual Studio to create your entire your entire workflow unless you really, really absolutely need to. And basically, the only things I would think that you need to is when you need to do something with like a state machine workflow or a do-while loop are the two things that are the only excuses that I would actually ever say that I need to have a custom Visual Studio developed workflow. Create new activities to satisfy custom logic and data access. So to the gentleman's point earlier, very easily could he did the Active Directory changes within a custom activity. Create Visual Studio workflows when you actually need to create custom flows, such as do-while loops, as I mentioned. Leverage in reusable workflows as much as possible. So define your workflows. If it's really kind of a common, more generic task, make that a reusable workflow so it can be used in multiple locations. When writing custom activities, my suggestion is that typically you have WCF services with your domain logic. Write those as make those WCF calls. Now that also then turns around and makes things so you can't make those sandboxed activities. But typically when you're pulling in some type of domain logic or external data, it can't be sandboxed anyways. So in that case, that's okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at that higher workflow. Now, as I mentioned before, in the very beginning, we had various steps that would pull the first name and last name for me, so I didn't have to specify those parameters. It gathered the team information, so all the different variant lookups. It pulled all this stuff together. Provisioned the resources. So here we're going to go and say after the business user goes through and says, "Hey, this is we need to get the laptop set up in the phone." They'll go ahead and call the procurement and phone provision hardware, and then the last step is to create the user in Active Directory. That's pretty much it, and that simple command is actually an out-of-the-box list command, so I can just go ahead and leverage that relatively easily. So in this case, where we're talking about creating a custom activity to do this, I didn't actually have to create a custom activity because I assumed my organization already had this WCF service for creating these Active Directory accounts for me. So I was able to use SharePoint Designer to connect to that WCF service, and then just treat it as an external list, and then using the workflow create item task, it was able to go ahead and do that without having to write any extra code. Yes?
What kind of guidelines do you recommend when you're working with Plain and InfoPath? If there are some notches in terms of like interacting with the SharePoint web services?
Yep. Can we hold on to that question for just a little bit, because I just wanted to get through the rest of it, because I'm almost done, and then I'll go ahead and answer your question the best I can. So with that, just to review the session objects, and don't get up right away because there's some important things I do want to mention. The two key things I wanted you to get out of this is to identify the various components that can be used to create a composite application on SharePoint, which we covered BCS, InfoPath, Word services, and workflow. Some things I did not cover is access services and Visio services. And Visio services is more good at kind of reporting on data or bringing back data like dashboards and that sort of thing. And the thing about access services, it's a great tool, but it kind of sits in its own silo. For instance, you can't really modify it with SharePoint Designer. My suggestion is if you have an access services app that's on SharePoint, don't try binding workflows to it, because the user who has that access database that they're syncing with may not realize that and may inadvertently break something with that. So it's always best to treat access and access services kind of as its own silo, not really part of the rest of your SharePoint environment. So a key big thing, SharePoint Conference 2011, October 3rd and 6th in California. I'll be there. Hopefully I'll see many of you there as well. Should be talking about all kinds of cool things out there. So register now because it's filling up fast. Some related content. OSP 305 it's going to be done by Chris Mayo. He's developing collaboration solutions in the cloud with Microsoft SharePoint Online. So he's going to show you basically not this demo per se, but another demo and how to actually do stuff with SharePoint Designer and Office 365 Online. 2 hands-on labs that are actually completely related to this presentation. Believe it or not, this entire presentation actually takes about 8 hours to create from beginning to end. It consists of 9 hands-on labs that I have created. 2 of them are downstairs in B1, I think, or B2, or in the hands-on labs room. So I created a section that involves dealing with the InfoPath forms themselves, so you can actually play with the InfoPath forms, and the one that connects to the external list and hooks up the create item task and actually walks you through it. Now, I didn't want you to go through all 9 labs because it takes an extreme amount of time. So I just took those 2 labs out of the total of 9. Now, the 9 labs, as the plan of right now, will be made available online, kind of like how our SharePoint Ignite experience is. There'll be a new composites, virtual instructor-led videos, as well as a set of hands-on labs. I will talk about the technologies themselves, and then we're going to add on as follow-on for more advanced understanding of how these things can be brought together. There's going to be 2 sets of scenarios. One is going to be training management that'll deal with everything from creating courses to actually administrating tests. So actually count down and test, and you can actually use this stuff within your own environment. And of course, this recruitment portal. Now, if you want to say, hey, you know what? This is cool stuff. I'd like to just see how it works, or maybe show it to my boss. I don't want to sit there for 9 hours to write the whole hands-on lab. That's absolutely doable because there's PowerShell scripts that go for each and every single hands-on lab that actually mimics each and every single step. So that way, you can say, I want to focus on labs 1, 4, and 5, and do 2 and 3 via PowerShell. And it's also a good way in case you mess something up in the lab, you're not too sure what you did. You can just go ahead and rerun that lab because everything is self-recovering. Other resources, My Tech Ed. Pretty sure you've seen these slides already. Tech Ed, Microsoft Learning Sites, MSDN, and Microsoft TechNet. Please complete your evaluation forms because you're going to win cool stuff. And you can scan this tag if you like to evaluate the session now on My Tech Ed Mobile. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you, and I'll take any questions that you may have. Thank you. Yes, could you go to the mic?